started in this work session, which frankly for me is a much awaited day, because just about a year ago this week, I went on a ride-along with Aaron Schmautz, one of our officers in East Precinct, and it was an eventful night in a couple of ways, but one way in which it was eventful was that he knew all the vacant, abandoned houses in his patrol area, and he'd been to them again and again and again. Several of them were occupied by squatters, several of them had been boarded up for years. Meanwhile, I know a lot of young people who are trying to buy their first home and are willing to buy anything in order to get that opportunity that I had when I bought a fixer-upper as my first house in Portland. And we're in a housing crisis in which we have unhoused people and people desperate to stay in the housing market. So what a disconnect that in a city with a red-hot housing market with a lot of people that need housing, where you can sell property for a very good return if you happen to own property, we have houses that are zombie houses and that are an enormous blight on their neighborhoods. So we have some city staff here who've been working hard on this issue, collaborating together between the auditor's office and Bureau of Development Services and my office and others, Police Bureau in particular, thank you, for cooperating and coming up with some very good ideas and proposals for how we can collectively get our act together and make a difference on this issue. So the good news is, I think, although this situation is currently unacceptable, we have the tools in our hands as city leaders to actually make a real difference on this issue. So I'm looking forward to doing just that, and I want to start this work session by calling up the two people in my office who've been working on this issue for quite a while now, Zach Klinoski and Chad Stover. Come on up. Good morning, guys.
Good morning. Are we on? Okay. Good morning. Thank you, Mayor Hales and City Commissioners. My name is Chad Stover. My title is Livability Project Manager on the Mayor's staff. I'm here with my colleague Zach Klinoski, who's Policy Advisor. And first, I'd like to hand out a run of show. I'm not sure if anyone, if we got this. Carly, can I? Okay. And a few that way. So Mayor Hales did a good job opening up the conversation. I'll continue just opening it up a little bit. And first I would like to paint a picture for you. In this conversation, we are really focused in on the vacant and distressed property, sometimes colloquially known as a zombie home. Now, in 3 years of working on livability issues under Mayor Hales' office, this is a phone call that has come into me, I know. It's not unusual at all for it to come in a couple times a month, 3 times a month, from somebody in East Portland or sometimes in North Portland where they're complaining about a nearby house where there's all kinds of chronic nuisance activities happening, drug trafficking, prostitution, other livability issues that have become a nuisance to the neighborhood, and they want to know what they can do about it. And at first, it might seem like a common sense thing to just call the police and to work with crime prevention. And you dig a little deeper into it and you find out that actually it's not that simple at all, because what you learn is that the owner of the house could be deceased and there's no heir to the property. This could be somebody who was living there and didn't really have much of a relationship with their neighbors, fell under hard times, fell behind on their mortgage payments, and received a notice of default from the bank. And that person didn't know his or her housing rights. And upon receiving that notice of default, he or she may have assumed this means that I have to get out right now, and out of panic and not knowing their housing rights, they end up leaving. And that person takes off and they leave town, and now nobody knows where they are, and because they didn't have much of a relationship with anybody in their neighborhood anyways, it's really hard for anybody to get in touch with that person. And that becomes a challenge for police officers and for our crime prevention staff who are working with the neighborhoods, because in the meantime, you might have squatters that move into the house, and in order to actively deal with that, we need to be in touch with the owners of these properties to issue trespassing, which creates a real challenge. So today, and so I want that specificity as we begin this conversation, because when we talk about the topic of chronic nuisance homes, oftentimes you could have the owner that's living in the house. And we're not focused on that particular house today. We're really focused on the ones in which the property owner is not in the house. I've dealt with both in my time as working on livability in the mayor's office, but we want to disaggregate down to this vacant and distressed property, the quote-unquote zombie home, which there is no property owner around.
Chad, on the so-called zombie homes, is it likely that there's also some kind of collection action going on where the Water Bureau is trying to get paid its arrears, that there are building code violations and other things that have been placed on the title and other things? So is it possible that there are multiple city bureaus trying to track down the owner at any one time?
Absolutely. You hit it right on the head, Commissioner Fish, and you'll hear from some of those city staff today. So we have a lineup of speakers, and we've been strategic in the way that we have our lineup. You'll notice on your run of show, we'll first hear from one of our neighborhood response team officers out in North Precinct. Sergeant Randy Teig is here, and he has spent inordinate amounts of time working on these types of homes. We put him first because it's often the case that a call will come into the police because of some of the livability issues that are here. They'll be the first responder. They'll go out and see the house. We'll also hear from our crime prevention staff, because at that point in time, police will often collaborate with crime prevention, and they'll start to go out and do outreach to the surrounding neighbors about different techniques and methods that they can use to deal with the chronic nuisance issues. We also have Miss Sally Bowman is here, and she is a neighbor who lives near one of these homes, and so you will hear firsthand testimony from one of the neighbors who knows what it's like to be next to one of these homes. And we will also hear from the auditor's office, my colleague Zach. They will talk about the foreclosure program that they have. The foreclosure manager is housed under the auditor's office, and they will be here to talk us through that process. And my colleague Zach is going to talk about a new concept that we're looking at here called the receivership model, something that the city has explored in the past and can do so. And we have looked at best practices in other cities to find out what's working elsewhere. And we have some ideas on how that might be able to be implemented here in Portland. And so that's our run of show. And your question is spot on, Commissioner Fish. It's always not just one agency within the city, but multiple offices that are responding in some shape to these kinds of homes. To help with the dialogue as we move forward, we're actually going to exemplify two specific houses that we thought are classic cases that represent this kind of vacant and distressed property. One of them, the address is 14630 Southeast Carruthers. Just a little bit of background, and you'll hear more about this from our experts in their testimony. This is a violation case that was opened up in 2010, and it has now collected $80,000 in liens on this house. So that's one house you'll hear about. Another house that you're going to hear about is 7926 Southeast 75th Place. This one was opened up in April of 2013, and it has now collected $85,000 in city liens. They're both vacant. These both fall under our definition of a vacant and distressed property. That's correct. One thing that I want to emphasize as we kick off this conversation is that Zach and I have been on something of a journey in our research and our learning curve, working with our colleagues in the Bureau of Development Services and the Police Bureau. And what we have learned is that as much as we wanted this to be a relatively simple fix, it is not a simple fix. We have come to realize that there is no silver bullet to curing this kind of problem. But we think that with the recommendations that we want to put forth today, that if we work collaboratively as a city and we muster some existing tools and think about bolstering some possible new tools working in harmony, we think that with everything moving on full cylinders, we can start pushing the needle on this a little bit. So I just want to create that context.
Chad, are there any sister cities that are doing good work in this area that you've looked at?
Absolutely, and you'll hear from Zach in a few minutes about the receivership model. I know he's done some research in Baltimore, St. Louis, and through working with our foreclosure office and the auditor's office, they've come up with a number of ideas that we've looked at in other cities as well. So probably one of the biggest assets that we've had in conducting our research on this is looking elsewhere, because to help also create the context for this conversation, it's important to know that this is not a Portland-specific challenge. This is something that is affecting American cities all across the country. And so that takes us into the bigger conversation. And what we hope today is that if we can bring all of our tools together in the city of Portland and become a unified voice, that's going to put us in a better standing to have the bigger conversation with the banks. Because the banks are a huge part of this, and creating that awareness at their level so that they know what kinds of things are happening locally is also important. Just a quick anecdote from myself working on livability issues and some of my colleagues that you'll hear from today who have actually tried to track down these owners. Not uncommon at all that we end up 3 or 4 phone calls later talking to somebody who is representing a bank in a far off place like Omaha, Nebraska, or St. Paul, Minnesota, and they've never been to Portland before. They don't know what 14630 Southeast Carruthers even is, or yet alone what Southeast Portland is. And it's a number on an Excel sheet to that person because they're dealing with these in such large masses. And so it's important for us to understand that national context, to understand what we really need to do locally to start pushing the needle on this in the right direction. Okay.
Bring up Sergeant Ty.
Actually, we got Zach.
Zach first,
Sorry.
Mayor and members of the City Council, for the record, my name is Zach Klonowski. I work as policy advisor to Mayor Hales. I want to touch very briefly about what I see as 5 big opportunities we seize by tackling this issue, and some of them have already been touched on, but the lack of affordable single-family houses here in Portland. To me, learning about this issue as Chad and I kind of went through our journey, it's unconscionable that we have vacant derelict properties rotting away when we're dealing with a housing affordability crisis and a homelessness crisis. The lack of housing inventory, especially modest single-family houses, is an issue that we're all struggling with, and dealing with these vacant distressed properties can help alleviate at least some of that housing shortage. And as the mayor alluded to, we have a red-hot housing market right now, so there's no doubt that there's a market for these houses if the city uses its resources to clear clouded title, which you'll learn today we have the ability to do. And then this is an equity issue, because far more of these vacant distressed properties are located in low-income neighborhoods, and no neighborhood should be subjected to the nuisances that arise when a home is left vacant and abandoned. The term we hear over and over to describe these houses from neighbors is that it's a nightmare. And then that goes right into livable neighborhoods, and removing barriers to get responsible property owners into these homes will help create more livable neighborhoods in all of the city. And then lastly, freeing up scarce police bureau resources is a huge potential gain from this. As you are all aware, we're dealing with an epidemic of gang violence, and having police officers respond to these houses over and over again rather than dealing with some of the tough challenges that we're dealing with as a city is something that we hope to correct. So Chad already walked you through the presentation, so we'll go ahead and turn it over to Randy Tagg.
Morning, Mayor, Commissioners. Yeah, yep.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor and City Council folks. I'm Dave Hendry. I'm the East Precinct Commander, and I just want to give you kind of a brief overview, just like Chad and Zach did, about kind of the distressed properties deals that we have at East. Randy will talk specifically on a couple cases, but to give you a scope of where we're at, we have approximately 375 of these properties just in East Precinct that they are managing one level or not. We have calls on our distressed properties, burglaries and trespassing to those properties every day. Every day our officers are responding to that. There's a huge resource cost for that for us, for law enforcement. As you know, we're short on staffing, and yet these are priority calls that we do need to go to. These homes left vacant, dilapidated, become crime hubs in these neighborhoods. And ultimately our goal is for protecting that neighborhood, oftentimes when we can't have a property owner present. That proves to be very difficult. We don't have a lot of tools for that. What we do have is our neighborhood response team, which is a specific group of officers that we can detail out to work on community and livability problems just in the precinct. Sergeant Tigg and his group focus primarily on the distressed properties, with about probably 50% of your workload.
Oh, yeah.
So with that being the case, it is a huge priority from us from a safety piece, from a community livability piece, and also effective resource management tool for us. Randy?
In the way of overview, we have, as the Commander said, 375 houses that we're managing, and we have secured over 400, so just in each precinct. And in the way of hours, I should have brought my reading glasses. Three. I appreciate that.
What's your prescription? You get 4 options.
It works perfectly. We're looking at administrative warrants. We've done 169 administrative warrants. That's working with BDS and other city bureaus, and that's 3,000 PPB hours in that. The 375 houses that we manage, and this is every day, we have 4,503 hours at the time I did this, human resource hours into those, since 2014. And as we said before, at this time we had 395 documented houses. And the neighborhood response team, what we've done is, as the commander said, this is a big part of what we do now. It's the number one complaint we get. And we have, thank you. We have special training that our officers have gone through. They've gone with BDS and learned what to look for, how to photograph these things. And we also went to the federal government, gave us some training on how to identify house theft. And it's hard to believe that's happening, but we have problems with people actually stealing these houses and defrauding people that they rent to and that type of thing. And to give you an idea, since we started doing this, this multidisciplinary group, which includes aging services, we use Fire Bureau, we use BDS, BES, and crime prevention. All of us work together as a group because sometimes there's unique scenarios here. As was pointed out, sometimes it's a house that's a very aged person lives there and is being taken advantage of, and it goes into to the point where it needs to be condemned. It can actually get that bad. So we bring in these social services to deal with these types of things. But to give an idea of the kind of time that goes into them, the 14630 Southeast Carruthers, this dating back to 2012, started out when it first went vacant. We had 3 calls for service, and then it went up to 5. And then once someone discovered it was vacant, we had 27 calls for service there, and then 10, and then we went in, boarded it up, 0 calls for service. And and the NERT hours involved in that was just about 70 hours, just for that one location. And then 7926 75th Place was one that got in the news quite a bit. It was that bad. And the neighbors and the schools were very upset about it. And that one there, we had about 95 calls for service before we boarded it up and vacated it. And we had about 96 hours of NERT hours, just NERT officers, so into that place. And to give you an idea of the impact that we've had, this multidisciplinary group, we did a little study 500 feet from the crime hub and what kind of impact it has on the neighborhood. So just in short, part 1 and 2 crimes, we had a 28% reduction in crime by addressing the house, getting it boarded up, and denying access. And that's part 1 and 2 combined. But burglaries, 42% reduction in burglaries, and 50% reduction in vice. So what that tells, the other side of that is we have a lot of effective prevention happening by addressing it, but that informs you how much crime it's generating, just by how much we affected the crime load by dealing with it.
So is somebody going to tell us why it took 95 visits before you were able to board it up?
Yes. It's first of all, because it's private properties, it's a complicated issue for us to get to the point where we can go in it and take some action. So what we did is we consulted DOJ, did some work on this back in 2012. We consulted some of the work they did. This is a huge problem in the state of Maryland. They have a big problem with this, and so there's a lot of research that was done on that. So what we did is we built a plan that enabled us, when the call comes in, we actually have a building block approach to it from that point. The neighbors complain about it. We don't go looking for them, but when the neighbors complain about it, then there's evidence of vacancy, which is a state law, and state law says if there's certain things present, broken windows, broken doors, trash and litter, that gives us the ability to understand that this is a vacated property. And once it's a vacated property, we know, based on what the DOJ has told us, that they are a health and crime hazard. And this has been documented. There's a lot of documentation to support that. So we utilize that best practice to support our enforcement action. And then we move forward, we get in, we board it up, we bring the Bureau of Development Services in, and that's when the fine process that we talked about on these 2 houses begins. And sometimes we have to vacate people out of the houses. Sometimes they're already vacant. Yep.
And obviously, some of these folks will still be around when we get to discussion here, but we want to make sure we hear from each of the members of this team. So now Stephanie Reynolds from Crime Prevention, talk about her perspective on this.
Good morning. Hello, Mayor, Commissioners. I'm Stephanie Reynolds. I'm the manager of the Crime Prevention Program with the Office of Neighborhood Involvement. And as I think you know, crime prevention staff, we work very closely with neighbors to help them resolve their chronic crime issues. And zombie houses are one of the most frustrating things that we ever work with. We get calls from neighbors, and we talk to them about exactly what they've tried so far to resolve the issue, and then we try to identify what gaps there might be in what's happened, so that we can try to make a whole package of an approach for them, to give them the best chance of getting the problem resolved. But I've got to say that even when all the bureaus are participating, even when the neighbors are organized with each other, even when everybody is doing everything they possibly can, it's still incredibly difficult to resolve these issues. And our staff, I polled them just a couple of weeks ago and said, so from your most recent work, how much time are you spending on this? And particularly for our staff in East Portland, but also for our staff in North, we're collectively spending about a half-time position on just vacant houses alone. And we deal with dozens and dozens and dozens of crime issues. This is a particularly time-consuming one, and it's a particularly frustrating one because of the stress of the community members that we're interacting with. People call us crying, sobbing. I'm not exaggerating. It is just unbelievably stressful and disgusting to have one of these houses next to you. I think one of the happiest days that we ever have with these houses is the days when one of these houses is boarded up either by the police or by BDS, and we're able to go out with them. And what we do is we go around to the neighbors, and we post these notices both on the house that's being boarded up, and then we also pass them out to the neighbors immediately surrounding the house. And we explain to the neighbors what's going on, why the house is being boarded. Usually they know exactly why the house is being boarded. And we give them some instructions on what to do if they see anybody trying to break back into the house, which unfortunately is not uncommon. Sometimes houses have to be boarded up repeatedly. But I can't tell you how joyful neighbors are, how they feel when they see the house being boarded up, because even though a boarded up house is not very attractive, it is far superior to what they've experienced up to that point. In a moment, we're going to have Hazelwood resident Sally Bowman come up and talk to you. She's had the misfortune of having to live next door to two of these houses, which, you know, one is more than anybody should have to bear, but two is just over the top. But I wanted to tell you briefly about the experience of a couple of other neighbors who weren't able to be here today. One of them is Rodolfo Ortega, who asked me to give you this picture of the backyard of his neighbor's house. What happened in this case is that Rodolfo's neighbor passed away, and this is in Powellhurst, Gilbert, by the way. His neighbor passed away, and the house was taken over by squatters. And so for 2 years, Rodolfo, his girlfriend Amanda, and their neighbors had to deal with drug deals, discarded syringes, prostitution, human waste. Squatters were literally cutting pieces off the house in the garage to burn in the fireplace because there was no heat in the house and the squatters needed heat. So it was a very stressful situation, and Rodolfo told us that he felt really scared and helpless, and that two of his neighbors actually moved away during this time because it was taking such a long time to resolve. They just couldn't take it anymore, so they moved away, which I think is really tragic. I also want to tell you the story of Mill Park resident Sharon Bohan. So her neighbors went into default and moved out of their house probably prematurely. They could have stayed longer. So there was this gap time during which the house went into limbo before the bank took it over. And she and her neighbors just endured, again, enormous piles of trash, a rat infestation. A lot of them had rats come into their house because of the piles of trash at the squatter house. And really blatant heavy drug use by the squatters. She said that one morning she looked out and there was a very frail, drug-addicted woman passed out in 40-degree weather on the squatter house porch, and she thought the person was dead. And it was, frightening and stressful. Before the squatters moved out, they realized that she was the one who had been complaining to BDS, and one of the squatters told her that he was going to take her out before he was kicked out of the house. And so even after the squatters moved out, she spent 6 months sleeping with a knife next to her bed because that's how frightened she was of what might happen. So I think that this is a problem that's uniquely stressful for neighbors, and they're often really astonished that it takes as long as it does take to resolve the issue. And so I'm really happy to be here today. Happy is the wrong word, but I'm pleased to be here today to talk about their experience and to hear about some interesting and innovative ways that we might be able to resolve these problems more quickly for people so they don't have to endure this. So thanks for listening.
Good morning. I'm Sally Bowman, as you can see from the sheet. I wrote out a little speech for you because I was nervous. Well, I moved into East Portland, East Precinct. I live between 135th Division and Stark, right by Lincoln Park Elementary School. And we moved there because my mom was working out in Sandy and my husband works downtown, so we wanted something kind of central between the two. And we also wanted somewhere for kids, because there's a park in the school. And I have at the time I had 3 kids. So when we moved in, the neighborhood was great. People next door were great. People on the other side were kind of quiet. They worked nights, so I didn't know them very well. And then in 2010, so we moved in 2009. 2010, they were foreclosed, and they moved out. And nothing really happened at first. You got some weeds growing really tall, so tried to get a hold of them. They were hard to reach. Finally got them on Facebook and said, hey, your weeds are really tall. Can you do something about it? And they're like, we don't live there anymore, and we're not going to even go there. They took our house. It's not our house, not our problem. So, well, who do you contact? So I called the police. Well, I didn't call the police. I talked to my neighbor, and she called somebody and got the weeds taken care of. And that was awesome, because then no more weeds, right? And you're thinking, okay, these people are gone. The house is in foreclosure. It's going to get taken care of, right? I mean, it's 2010. So, the weeds were taken care of. So yeah, I'm going to look at my list here of things that happened. Oh, and then somebody decided they wanted to move into the house. A squatter, that is. Somebody who shouldn't be moving into the house. And we didn't really notice them at first because they were coming at night. But then we started seeing trash around the house, and we started seeing, they were throwing bottles out in the yard, and they were, leaving litter around, and the house was starting to kind of smell funny. And this is right next door to me. So I'm here, they're here. And so we're like, well, there's somebody in there that shouldn't be there. We're going to have to call the police, right? So called the police. Police came out, and they weren't home when the police got there. So police were like, well, we can't make them leave if they're not there. So they're coming back at night repeatedly. So they said they would board it up. That was great. We're really happy. Police came in, boarded it up, and we tried to get a hold of the management company, put a big sticker on the window, and management company was impossible to get a hold of. So they boarded the house up. Not all of the windows, just the ones that were broken into. And then along comes the next squatter. And they were like, oh, look, this house is vacant. We can see that because there's a big sticker on the window that says that the house is empty. So they moved in, and we called the police. Police come back because they had kicked down the boarded up door to get in. And in the meantime, this house is starting to smell worse and worse, So the police came out again, and the new management, because the management changed during this time. They had a no trespass agreement with the first management company, and with the previous owner didn't want anything to do with it. They wouldn't sign a no trespass agreement, but the management company was like, yes, you can go in there. So that was good. And so then again, squatter moves in, call the police kick them out. We went through that 3 or 4 times, and then finally there was kind of a scary guy that moved in with a big knife, and he's whacking, the stuff around the house with his machete or whatever to try to, cut back the bushes so he can get in the backyard to go in the house. So I'm like, oh, call the police again. I think I called the police. At this point, I've talked to every single one of the people in the response center, like, oh, hi, it's me again. Can you send someone out as soon as possible to move these people along? So that was, let's see, 2012. We had people that were walking through our yard because there was a space in the fence that they could just step over. And it was easier to walk through our yard than the vacant house yard. So I was not happy about that. I went out and was yelling at them. My husband's like, come back in the house. Don't go out there and fight with these people that you don't know. You're going to get in trouble. Oh, my car was broken into in 2012. And they stole a bunch of little random things. But, it's under $200. I can't claim it on my homeowner's insurance. Called the police and they said, well, we're not going to come out to file a report because it's only like, it's a small amount of money. Well, yeah, it's a small amount of money. I don't have like $200 to go out there and buy it all again. So you just live without it. And then, we had another squatter that actually moved like their entire, like everything in the kitchen sink into the house, like everything. They had like their stuff for the bathroom. They had their TV. They were going to set up housekeeping here. They had piles and piles of stuff. We saw it because they moved it back out when the police came and told them to leave. And the neighbors taking pictures like, look at all this crazy piles of stuff. They're moving in. So they left. And when they boarded up the house again, these people came out and they took a jigsaw. I kid you not. These people cut a hole in the door because it was boarded shut. I was so surprised to come home with like this big hole in the door. Because then what do you do? How do you board that up? I guess put another bigger board, but it starts to get expensive after a while. Oh, and then it was graffitied. The side of the house was graffitied, and it wasn't just words. It was like a big picture of something you don't normally see on the side of a house. You don't want to see on the side of a house. And I live next door to this house. Well, next door to that house is another house, a red house. And that red house became vacant as well. And because those people went in. They didn't go into foreclosure, she says. I talked to her as well, and she said that she's working with the bank. So it's been 2 years since she moved out. And then directly across the street from that is the elementary school. So we've got this, gross graffiti on the side of the house facing the elementary school. Anytime the kid drives down the street, everybody parks on our street to take their kids to school, so they're going to see that. You have so many bureaus you have to contact if you want something done, and you try to contact just one, and they're like, no, you need to call here, and so you call there, and sometimes you get the person, sometimes you don't. It gets really frustrating after, I guess it's been 5 years now that I've been dealing with these crazy people in and out. Let's see. So that was the first house. The first house, all sorts of lovely things happened there. Then 2015, that the red house was vacant. These people moved out. So it's looking okay at first, They're coming back, trimming the bushes and stuff for the first year or so. Then after about the first year, they live in Gresham now. They're like, oh, we're tired of dealing with this house now. So then the trash starts to accumulate at the house, and the weeds start to get really long, and people move in. And these people that moved in there were also breaking into cars again, so I got my car broken into again. And the neighbor across the street had their car stolen, and the people on the block behind us got their car stolen. And we didn't think it was entirely related, but we knew that these people had issues with other people because we had finally kind of collaborated with each other. I mean, I had 4 neighbors that kind of triangulated the house, and they would talk to each other about how, oh, hey, there's somebody, somebody parked in the driveway. And then so I'd look in the backyard because I had access to the backyard, and they'd look in the front yard, and we kind of make sure that there wasn't anybody, in and out. And there were people in and out. And so we called the police about that. And we also contacted the neighbor that owned the house because we actually knew her phone number, talked to her. And she said to us oh, they're just normal homeless people living in the house and it's raining. Just let them stay while it rains and they'll leave on their own. And they were there in and out of that house. We told them to leave, because we were finding needles in the street. We've got trash in the yard and it's starting to smell again. I mean, this house still smells if you come over and walk by it because it's starting to warm up now. It's like, hold your nose and walk past the house towards the park. But anyhow, trying to think if there was anything else that was fun that happened at that house. Not fun, but yes, they are. One of them actually sold. We've got somebody in there tearing out all the innards, and I'm worried about them. I think they should be wearing protective gear because, I mean, they're exposed to not only like the needles, because I told you there's lots of needles inside that house. When there was one of the police that came out had us come over with him because we told him that we thought there might be someone inside and we were willing to help with the boarding up. I mean, we had that house next door to us boarded up repeatedly, so we got to know the police pretty well. And also, if the police don't show up right away and the people have left and the house is like kind of open, it's like, okay, we want to close that up. So we'd go over there and look, and it's just so gross in there. I mean, I told you it smells, but they use the toilet and there's no running water in these houses and it is overflowing. It's not just like, once or twice, it's like there's poop everywhere. And there was also, they used adult diapers in the closet in the bedroom because now, the bathroom is unusable. So they're in the bedroom doing this yucky stuff. So I live right next door to this and I have 4 kids now. And I don't want to let my little kids out in the yard because, what are they being exposed to? It's gross. Anyhow, so yeah, these guys that are in there now, they're just in there now. Like this last month, they bought the house. The first house that I talked about, yeah. They bought the house from auction, or actually I think that somebody else bought it from auction and then sold it to them. But they're in there working on it. And I'm like, I really hope you're wearing a mask and gloves at least, if not like full body armor, But I don't. Well, yeah, 2010 and well, it's actually 2016. So yeah, 6 years of living next to this pile of yuckiness. Anyway. And the neighbors are all, we formed a neighborhood watch in March, actually. So that's how I've talked to crime prevention multiple times. I was in touch with the first crime prevention coordinator no longer works there. Next crime prevention coordinator no longer works there. Now I'm in touch with Celeste Perry, who's the crime prevention coordinator for my neighborhood. She's pretty awesome. So hoping she'll stick around and hoping that this red house on the end gets taken care of. Thanks for listening.
Okay, so now the response effort that we have in BDS, Mike Liefeld's here, and Mitch McKee is also here as a recently retired guy. I appreciate you making a victory lap here.
That's all right.
And you've got some slides?
We will,
So
yes.
we might want.
Sure, yeah, we can. Oh, yeah, great, yeah, please. Yes. So good morning, Mayor, members of council. My name is Mike Liefeld. I'm the BDS Enforcement Program Manager. And as we already know Mitch McKee, he's my lead senior housing inspector for the Extremely Distressed Property Enforcement Program, recently retired on April 1st. So this is his commitment. He loves the program, wants it to succeed. We formed the Extremely Distressed Property Enforcement Program in 2011 at the height of the economic recession and the peak of mortgage-related foreclosures. This was a new program, not new tools, but it was a new focus area for the Bureau. We moved from a model of compliance, education, to, I would say, extreme enforcement to tackle these serious problems at some chronic properties. We focused on unmaintained properties, often caused by abandonment, illegal squatting, and foreclosures. These properties have nuisance and housing conditions on the property that create risks of fire, public health hazards, encourage criminal activity such as trespass, vandalism, graffiti, drug use and sale, prostitution, and additional serious public safety threats. So what the Bureau leverages is the city's property maintenance code, where we address the exterior conditions of the property, the structure, and the interior conditions. We have we're a complaint-based enforcement program, so we have no shortage of complaints every year. But when we talk about these extremely distressed properties, we came up with some criteria to figure out what we were going to assign our resources to. Those criteria include abandoned foreclosed properties with illegal occupancies. Abandoned foreclosed properties generate multiple complaints to BDS, ONI crime prevention, and Portland Police Service calls regarding illegal activity. Occupied properties without the minimum utilities, such as current water service, electrical service, a heat source, etc. Those are serious fire, life safety dangers for occupants and surrounding property owners. And then we look at abandoned foreclosed properties with chronic, significant, and recurring nuisance and housing maintenance violations, which have resulted in unpaid enforcement lien balances. And we'll get into that more in the presentation. So again, program started in 2011. We currently have 55 EdPEP cases that are active right now throughout the city. We have another 49 cases that are pending, which we haven't had a chance to get to start working up the case. Since 2011, we have resolved 88 violation cases at the properties. I think in talking with Mitch, I think we've vacated over 50 properties in that span of time. We've completed 5 demolitions of structures, and we have 2 other demolitions that are pending. So again, this is a really, it diverges from our educational compliance-based model, where we are trying to exercise all the authority granted to us in Title III and Title 29 of the City Code. So again, with the EdPEP program, we're citing violations. We're pursuing extreme enforcement. We're going through the code hearing. It is a lengthy process. We have to obtain that legal authority to get the search warrants, get the vacate orders, go through the demolition process. Demolition is the last resort. The Bureau's interest is not in knocking down every structure. We really look to a demolition when the property has lost all of its utility, it's not salvageable, and that is really the only reasonable course of action. With the EdPEP program, we make a commitment to the neighbors. The EdPEP program, once you're in our queue, once we start a case, we're going to stay on that case until it's finished. And the finished for us means it's vacated or demolished. The correction of the cited violations may come several years later. But we make that commitment. So as PPB and crime prevention mentioned, we get calls from the neighbors. They know if it's broken into again, we're going to come out and board it quickly. We're going to vacate people off. So we work a lot with our other agencies to respond to neighborhood concerns even after the initial enforcement action. So with that, I want to turn it over to Mitch, who can take us through 2 properties that we want to highlight here, just for your information.
Thank you.
That one?
Yep.
Okay. Before I get started on these real quick, I did want to make a brief comment. The person, the Sharon that Stephanie had talked about, who slept with the knife by her bed, when I had the hearing on this to vacate the property, the squatter showed up at the hearing, and Sharon was courageous enough to come to the hearing and testify on behalf. So that was just, I just wanted to mention that. 14630 Carruthers, the owner here received a notice of default in about July of 2009. She then moved out of the property, went out to live with her boyfriend in Gresham, and thought she was out of the picture there. We opened a case in December of 2010 for housing code violations, and cited it then. There were continuous calls for Police Bureau, continuous complaints to us for trash accumulations and debris. The house was occupied by a niece relative of the owner, and she rented out rooms at the property to make some extra money. Continued accumulations of trash, There was no power, no water in the house. We vacated the property in December of 2014 and boarded up the property. After that, there was a fire that occurred there in February of 2015. The property is still in the original owner's name, and the liens continue to accrue on this property for the enforcement case and for continued cleanups. 7926 Southeast 75th Place. The owner filed bankruptcy, and the bankruptcy papers showed that the property was discharged from the ownership in May of 2011. We actually opened a housing case in April of 2013 for housing code violations, and this house had enormous accumulations of trash and debris on the outside, was occupied by a gentleman named Kenny who lived in the main house. There was an illegal addition on the back that was occupied. Two of the campers in the front were occupied, and a small building that was also illegal occupied in the backyard. And some of the people at this property were extremely bad folks, so the neighbors were real happy to see them gone. Continued calls to the police and complaints to us about trash and debris. The house was occupied again with no power, no water, no trash service. This one actually was featured in the media as well. And this is not uncommon. A bunch of these houses that I work on are featured in the media as being so bad as to have a huge impact on the neighborhood. We vacated and secured the property in January of 2014, cleaned up the yard a second time, secured all the buildings. There were occasional break-ins after that, but mostly the most imperative problems went away at that point. The property is still in the original owner's name. It's been transferred to a different mortgage receiver, which is pretty common. What I found is that the banks will start their foreclosure process typically not until the property is vacated or empty, and work on the process for a year or two. It takes maybe 2 years to actually complete a foreclosure process, but I'm talking to some of the bank's attorneys that work on foreclosures. They're a little frustrated that once it nears the foreclosure end, the bank will block out maybe 100 or 200 properties, transfer them to another loan servicer, and that way they have to start the process all over again. It has a tendency to enhance the value of the property through inflation, so somehow these are to the bank's advantage. This continues to accrue liens on the property, and just one more little note is that the gentleman here, Kenny, actually moved into another house that was also an EdPEP property, and continued to live there. Thank you.
So I just wanted to touch on a few more items. I mentioned that we currently have a large number of cases that are pending. Our program is complaint-driven, and for the EdPEP properties, most of those complaints and referrals are coming from PPB and crime prevention. They have the best eyes on the street, and once we coordinate with them, we've made efficiencies so they can start collecting the evidence, make our enforcement process seamless so we can get to a code hearing sooner than later. So that's been a great coordination effort there. We currently have 2 full-time senior housing inspectors dedicated to the EdPEP program. We're just working through the case log. We work a case, get it to a point where we can step away from it for a little while, start the next case. In our budget request for fiscal year 16-17, we are asking for another full-time senior housing inspector position, our 3rd EdPEP inspector, just to deal with the amount of referrals that are still coming into us.
In addition to more people to do the work, what else would be helpful to you in transitioning these properties from this unacceptable condition that they're in today. I mean, we've got to keep understanding that how unacceptable this is. I hope that's obvious to everyone. I know it's been obvious to you for a long time, but this is unacceptable in our city. That's our starting point. So given that it's unacceptable, given that you've been doing a good job with the program, given that you could use some more folks to do the work, what else would help?
So our response is not a long-term solution. It essentially is a Band-Aid for those surrounding neighbors where we secure the vacate order and a small number will demolish the house, but that is the exception. We certainly are interested in other tools available to relieve the property owner from that responsibility, because our cases are going to show that it could span a number of years, exceed 5 years, 7 years, where we do not have a responsible party who is willing to maintain the property up to the city's
So
minimum
by
standards.
relieve, you mean foreclose?
That is one tool, and I believe other jurisdictions use foreclosure. It is more than a collections effort. It is an enforcement effort at some level, and so I think we need to think about that, because we cannot relieve the owner's responsibility. We can take it up to the point where we vacate the property, but we're still maintaining the property then for a responsible party,
You're
whether
in fact
that's
a
the bank.
property manager for an irresponsible owner.
Exactly. So, if there's processes available that would get us to the point where we can maintain it, but then it's put into the market somehow or dedicated to get it back into a legal habitable use, that's the Bureau's interest.
Yeah, again, let me characterize that the way I've come to understand that, and that is the Police Bureau and the Bureau of Development Services are, in the current state of affairs, the property managers for extremely irresponsible property owners. We are spending large amounts of public funds to intervene again and again and to attempt to maintain a low-level condition for real estate owned by other people. That's what we do. I'm not criticizing what you do. I'm just saying we are the property managers for slumlords. Actually, worse than slumlords, because slumlords actually have paying tenants.
Just to clarify just a little bit, the people who own these properties retain title and ownership of property for all this time, all this 7 years that it takes. The banks are not acting as they should to foreclose on these properties. So it's hard to characterize the owner as the one that's being irresponsible.
The owner.
So I guess, Mitch, maybe setting up future panels, but why are the banks not interested in putting a property that's not being used into the market? And then you mentioned, I was just curious about this point you mentioned about mortgage service providers. Right before the foreclosure deadline reaches, they transfer them? This is to another company, and why do they do that again?
I believe that the banks, this is just opinion. I'm not an expert on these legal matters, but I understand that the banks, the longer they let it sit, the more the value of the property increases. So it becomes pretty high. And then also the indebtedness of the owner, of the purchaser, also increases a huge amount. And I just want to help with that point a little bit. I actually found a notice of trustee's sale on the Carruthers property. And that notice was no payments from April of 2009. And the payments due were $138,000. And the total required for payoff is $351,000. So they have accrued all these additional charges in addition to their loan payoff amount. So it just becomes huge. Now, somehow that...
Does that include liens in that notice?
No, that's just the bank's money. That's just what they want.
I haven't entirely figured this out on a financial basis. I have a little understanding of real estate. You do as well, Dan. But I think what might be happening is that these properties aren't rising in value so fast that the bank makes more money if they wait, right? Because the house is losing value while the land in Portland's real estate market is gaining value. But while the house is being trashed, it's radically losing value.
Correct.
But their ability to write off a loss against taxes elsewhere in their corporate balance sheet might be enhanced by taking, let's say, a $300,000 loss on a house that honestly is only worth $100,000 because that's what the lot's worth. And that would be an extremely cynical thing for banks to be doing. So I don't know that they're doing that. But it might be that they're writing off losses in Omaha or New York based on the catastrophic decline of a house in Portland.
Mayor, let me just jump in on something, because my impression during the recession is that banks were trying to shed their portfolios of these assets much more quickly. You had a lot of short sales, you had a lot, and so there was a different approach, which was get this stuff off the books. So I'm just trying to understand, why has that changed? What's changed then? Is it some change in the law federally that created this perverse incentive? Is it different accounting rules? Is it market dynamics? Because again, I think during the recession, we had lots of foreclosures and lots of short sales. And in my neighborhood, there were a lot of properties that were troubled properties that got fixed up and sold very quickly. And so what's...
Well, in a lot of cases, most of these properties have the foreclosures. There's tons of them everywhere. What we look at is the most distressed properties. And so I think they act more quickly on a lot of those better value properties, the ones that will turn over and sell for a higher amount. But when it gets down to these bottom end properties, so to speak, it's my understanding that they're actually federally insured. So it could be that when they get to a certain point, the banks can write it off and receive the money that their loan is guaranteed for. So again, I'm not the expert here, but that's just guessing again.
Mitch, we really appreciate your service. We're going to miss you.
Oh, well, thank you
But
very much.
hopefully, one of the things that you're leaving behind is an enhanced consciousness of the importance of the work that you've been doing and that others are carrying on and that we can do a lot better.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
the police as well.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you both. Okay, let's now turn to a tool that we have not yet used enough, but that we might use more, and that is foreclosure. Sarah Landis. Good morning. Good morning.
I also have a PowerPoint presentation, but I have slides, so
Okay.
hopefully you can follow along
Okay.
as we go.
Just pass them down.
Okay, good morning. I'm Sarah Landis, Chief Deputy City Auditor, and with me is Marco Maciel. He's the Foreclosure Program Manager. And we are going to talk today about the city's existing foreclosure program. So Marco, if you could start the presentation. We've lost Carla, so our support staff, our technical support. Well, I'll go ahead and get started. Yeah, we just need to get the PowerPoint up. So start with the first slide. Foreclosure is a legal procedure in which a lien holder repossesses a property when an owner is in default on their liens. In the context we're talking about today, these are properties that have liens placed on them by the Bureau of Development Services, which is the lien holder. These can be liens for nuisance abatement, for which the city has incurred costs, or for code compliance penalties. And the process of foreclosure is managed by the auditor's office through the point of decision to foreclose by council, and the actual foreclosure sale is handled by the city treasurer. The next slide. With the introduction of the code enforcement program by BDS, the auditor's office saw a dramatic increase in the number of delinquent assessments. By 2003, there were about 3,700 special assessments in arrears in the amount of approximately $10 million. So this represents lost or delayed revenue back to the Bureau. To help address the increasing delinquency problem, the auditor's office proposed the reintroduction of foreclosure as a tool to recover delinquent assessments. One click, she's there.
Carla, you know you've become indispensable.
The foreclosure program is a component of the Assessments, Finance, and Foreclosure Division in the Auditor's Office. It is funded through the Local Improvement District Fund, and it employs 1.5 FTE. The program serves bureaus across the city that assess properties to pay for improvements. These can be for local improvement district projects, for system development charges, sidewalk assessments, sewer projects, nuisance abatements, code enforcement fines, et cetera. So it's a pretty large portfolio, and the slice of the liens that we're talking about today is a small percentage of our portfolio. We have responsibility for the entire life cycle of the liens, from recording the assessment to billing property owners and collecting the money owed. Okay, so the next slide, I think we're caught up.
Fine, so the $13 million recovered to date is recovered from foreclosure sales?
It's from the collections effort for cases that have come into the foreclosure program. So once traditional collection efforts have been exhausted by the Revenue Bureau, the cases are transferred back into our office to the foreclosure program, and Marco engages on all kinds of collections efforts to try to turn those properties over or to bring those accounts into compliance with their payments.
That's a very successful collections effort.
That's
and I
correct.
appreciate it very much, but I think it's important to be clear. When was the last time we foreclosed on a house?
1971.
The city foreclosed in 1971.
So one policy choice for us as a city
Mm-hmm.
is to tell our auditor and our auditor staff, you have this council's backing in foreclosing on distressed properties. That we will take the political heat, if any, for foreclosing on properties owned by Wall Street banks that are derelicts and nuisances in our neighborhoods. I don't think that's a big political risk, frankly, for us to intervene and use the authority that you have. But we have not foreclosed on a house in over 40 years.
Yeah, you are correct on that. The reason why we have achieved the 75% in our recovery is that when we get to that point, case in point right now of those houses, a couple of them have already contacted us when we got into them. And so when we get to point of foreclosing, they come and pay us. But that doesn't really, right, no, that's what I'm saying. When we, the expense that we have had, as we get to that point, they will pay. And that too is not gonna be available anymore to get the property back into the market as it is. And it's a constant that, you know how they manipulate the market.
Very capably managed negotiation program.
Right,
Negotiation is one of the options.
right, and that's what we do.
Okay, so the limitations of the code, the city code that we adhere to, Title V, Chapter 30, which is the collections and foreclosure process, limit us to focusing our efforts on the collection of liens, including foreclosure when necessary. That portion of the code is not intended to enforce property maintenance regulations, and I think it will require quite a bit more collaboration and communication with development services and with the other bureaus we work with to close the gap and to move us towards what Mike Liefeld suggested should be an enforcement arm of the foreclosure program as opposed to just being a collections mechanism. We're ready and willing to start working on that right away, and we have the collections committee getting ready to meet next week to start that process. I want to go through a little bit of what our recovery looks like, because it is not a traditional collections method. We're focused on recovering costs to the city in a way that's transparent and fair to property owners. And I don't know if you can get that back up, but there is a purpose and authority slide that has the direction for the auditor's office on when and how foreclosure should be used. As Marco said, in our experience, most lien accounts resolve themselves far short of foreclosure. They become current in their payments, receive waivers or reductions from the bureaus, or the property is sold. So most times foreclosure is not a necessary step, but the specter of foreclosure can be a tool to bring property owners into compliance with their payments. The seizure of property is one of the most controversial and drastic actions a government can take, and for this reason, the auditor's office considers foreclosure only in the most egregious and necessary cases, such as those that BDS identified in the distressed and vacant properties list that it provided us. There is a, believe it or not, very simplified flow chart of the foreclosure process on the next slide. I'll try to quickly walk you through the process. Once an account becomes delinquent and has gone through standard collection attempts by the Revenue Bureau, it's transferred to the foreclosure program. The foreclosure manager contacts the property owner in writing, emphasizing the gravity of the situation and the ramifications of inaction. The notice specifies that the property will be placed on the foreclosure list unless the owner elects to pay under a payment plan or brings the account current. If the owner is responsive, a payment plan is drafted, and as long as payments are made, okay, the account is out of delinquent status and no longer at risk of foreclosure. It's important to note that a property owner may be current on lien payments and therefore have an account in good status without necessarily having ever addressed the underlying problems with the property. So that's one of the major limitations of the foreclosure process as a solution for severely distressed properties. Marco's approach and our office's approach to collections is a little different than traditional collections agencies. Many owners are unable to care for their properties. They're also the most vulnerable among us: the elderly, those with mental and physical health challenges, veterans, and those who can no longer take care of their financial affairs for other reasons. In many cases, the foreclosure manager acts as a social worker, attempting to match property owners with social, community, government, and family resources that can help them resolve the issues with their properties. And we've developed a network of agencies and institutions that includes Adult Protective Services, Legal Aid, Elders in Action, and others. So communication paired with the potential of property foreclosure are the most powerful tools that our office uses. Sorry, I'm cutting in and out. A plan that's satisfactory to both the city and the property owner is developed, and we have achieved results by providing counseling and guidance to property owners together with efforts to collect. Okay, so back to the flow chart. If efforts to work with property owners are not effective, staff will consider moving forward with foreclosure. Individual case files developed for each delinquent account that includes a history of the problems with the property and efforts at collection. The foreclosure manager uses this information to make recommendations on whether to potentially revise the lien amount and payment terms. And these recommendations are then submitted to the collections committee for a decision. City Code charges the collections committee specifically with the responsibility of accepting, revising, or rejecting the auditor's recommendations on what is essentially a last best offer before the property is placed on the foreclosure list for council vote. Any adjustments to the payment amount must take into account other violations, history of cooperation, the owner's financial circumstances, the scale of the violation, whether it's repeated or intentional, and other mitigating or aggravating factors. The collections committee itself is comprised of 4 staff members, representative from 2 members of the city council, 1 from the Bureau of Development Services, and 1 from the Office of Management and Finance. Once the committee has reached a decision, the property owner is notified in writing and has 30 days to take action. If the owner accepts the committee's determination, the process starts over again with drafting a payment plan. Otherwise, the owner can then appeal the determination to the hearings officer if the case has not already been to the hearings officer. If the owner rejects the committee's determination, or the case has already been to the hearings office, or the case goes to the hearings office and the determination of the collections committee is upheld, the case will be included in the foreclosure list to council. Okay. And as Marco mentioned and I mentioned, we've periodically convened the collections committee, and in our experience, this process has produced good results in that it pressures owners into taking action. The majority of cases we consider for foreclosure resolve as the case files are being developed or the property owner accepts the adjustment in payments and gets into compliance on their accounts, whether or not they actually resolve the underlying issues with the property. Council's responsibility. The next step is to submit the list to council, which votes on properties to include in the foreclosure list and which properties, if any, the city has an interest to purchase. The council clerk then transmits the foreclosure list to the treasurer. The treasurer has a long list of responsibilities to bring foreclosure to fruition, including implementation of the sale, management of the redemption process, and issuance of deed. Because we've not foreclosed on a property for so long, this will be a new process for the treasurer, and so rules and procedures will have to be developed, and I imagine there will be some impact on her workload. It's also important to mention that even after a sale is conducted, the property owner has a 1-year redemption period in which they or anyone with a recorded interest in the property can redeem the property by payment in full of their lien and costs. This puts a significant delay in getting the property into more productive use, but is important to protect property owner rights. Once the redemption period expires, the treasurer will execute a deed conveying the foreclosed property.
Is the 1-year redemption period code or statute?
It's state statute that we have also copied into code.
Based on 223, which is state that statute.
Say again, Mark.
We try to mirror our code on state statute 223, and so they require to have the redemption period.
So can I just ask a kind of, I guess, obvious question then? If you have a successful foreclosure, but someone has a 1-year redemption period, doesn't that effectively prevent anyone from improving the property for the 1 year? Since the redemption period would allow that person to acquire the property at their existing basis?
I think
Not
Zach
as-
will be prepared to talk about that when we talk about receivership as an
Yeah,
option.
not necessarily, because what can happen, just to conclude here for Mr. Fish, is that during that period, nothing precludes the person who has the certificate to this then or still property owner. So they can get into an agreement or sign a contract.
Whatever.
Right.
So let me, again, make sure, because I've been learning on this issue all along over the last year or two, but I want to make sure no one feels criticized for the work they're doing now, just as I was with BDS. You're doing a great job. In fact, if we're in the private sector, we should be paying you a bonus because you're bringing in $1 million a year, right? But this program, as it's been managed since the 1970s, before any of us started work here, before Dan Salzman was born, this program since the 1970s, particularly during Marco's tenure here, is doing a really good job of getting the city paid. That's what this program does, is it makes the city more whole by getting liens paid. But what it doesn't do is take care of these egregious neighborhood nuisances. So now, as Sarah described, there's better communication starting to happen between our bureaus, because a big part of the problem here is multiple bureaus involved. So let me put this to you. You've got a list now of 25 extremely distressed, vacant, abandoned houses. Based on what you know so far, is there any reason not to foreclose on those houses?
Well, the first 4 that Marco has looked at, 3 of those have come in to make payments on their liens.
Are they fully paid?
They are not fully paid, but they are in compliance with making payments on their liens, and they've had discussions with him about coming into compliance with the underlying property issues. One of them has sold. So this has been our experience for many years. By the time that we get with properties to the point where we're looking at foreclosure, the pressure starts to increase on those owners,
Right.
and it is effective at getting them to take some action.
So Sally put up with a situation like this for 6 years. What do you think will happen to the speed of property owner response when you bring the first foreclosure ordinance to the city council in 45 years?
I hope it will speed up, but there's no guarantee that the property owner won't come in and start making payments on the lien, because that may be cheaper.
And if they cure the defects
Yeah.
in the property and put it in habitable condition and rent it to somebody or sell it to somebody, that's great. The goal here is not for the city
That's
to
right.
own real estate. The goal is for us to take advantage of market conditions to get banks that are sitting on properties and not caring about the side effects on Portland neighborhoods to have a different set of financial signals than we're giving them today. And I think, my personal opinion, and we'll get it, the question is, do we foreclose or do we put them into receivership? And that's what Zach will talk about next. Once we bring that hammer down, in a market where you can sell your property for more than it's worth if you've owned it for more than 6 months, people will act. People are rational. It's just that they're also, in some cases, rational and completely uncaring about the side effects of their ownership.
I mean, we are in complete agreement, and we have been, during this conversation and discussion that we are having, the fact is that if we don't use all the tools that we have at our disposal, using only one, push to one side. So we need to find a way where we put all of those tools synchronized, that we squeeze them in the center. The banks being one example, for example, we can locate, like Zach mentioned, many of the property owners we can locate because the servicing company who is working for the bank is behind. So we try to reach everything that you look at the county is in John Doe's name. John Doe is not there for 10 years. So until we get to find out, we need to come up with a tool where we can force the banks to, if you did foreclose on this property at a certain date, the city of Portland, you have to have so many days when you have to convey that property to your name. Once you convey to their name, so it's much easier for us to foreclose because we know who to go after, and then the city, using the other tools that we have, okay, 30 days you have to convey your name. On that 30 days, BDS can start the process of having a code against the property. That opens the door for us in foreclosure to open, to go after them. Or there are properties like Zach probably gonna mention later on, where receivership is another tool. And in the case of receivership, some of them can even be the person who is living there but cannot take care of the property and is willing to come to the CDA. I'm willing to.
Well, so can I just make sure I understand something? Because having practiced law once upon a time, I know that there's a whole cottage industry in this country devoted to evading paying bills and using the legal tools. And so at the 11th hour under our current system, someone can theoretically come in and make a deal and agree to do a payment schedule. And that's where you've been quite successful in recovering money. So that's what can happen at the 11th hour. Also at the 11th hour, someone can file for bankruptcy, right? And get a stay and put a halt to the whole proceeding. So those are at least two options. And then, Sarah, in terms of what you said earlier about like older adults who can't maintain their homes and you bring in elders in action and everything else, do we also coordinate with the utilities to make sure those individuals are getting or are eligible and receiving the discount programs that the city has for low-income homeowners? Is there a automatic referral so that while you're trying to stabilize the homeowner, we're making sure they're qualifying for any discount programs?
Mostly use is elders in action, and so when they go there, they try to make this coordination because there are instances where they cannot take care of their affairs anymore, even paying for their utility and things like, and that's when we use someone like an institution like Elders in Action.
But Chad mentioned this earlier, and I want to reiterate this. This is a whole bunch of very complex issues here.
Right.
They get even more complex when the owner is still entitled to
Right.
the house, thus the bankruptcy scenario, or when there's someone still living in the house. Those aren't the houses we're talking about today. We're talking about the house that no one has legitimately lived in for years, and where the legal owner who's on the title has long since relinquished interest. So their bankruptcy or non-bankruptcy is no longer an issue. That bank owns that house.
correct.
In all but title in some cases, or in title in other cases. But we're talking about a distant bank, not a bereaved home buyer who is the other party here.
And just to emphasize this aspect that you brought up, is another thing that we have when it comes to us to prevent what happened in 1971. We go and look at each one of them separately because you don't want to dislodge someone that is there who is not capable of taking care of their own affairs.
They got spooked by in the 1970s was the prospect that we would kick grandma out of the house and foreclose on it. That's not what we're talking about here. Grandma or whoever was in that house is long gone. There have been squatters in there 3 times. We're spending, again, you're doing a great job bringing in $1 million a year. We're spending far more than $1 million a year in police work alone, not to mention crime prevention, not to mention BDS, not to mention Fire Bureau. So this, I want to really keep our focus on these most egregious houses because those are the ones that we can act most decisively on, and they're the ones that are having the worst problems.
I think it's really important that BDS continue to bring these to our attention because we are, essentially in the office. It's a paper exercise and conversations on the phone, and so we don't have police reports coming across our desk that tell us which of these properties need the most attention. So this is a great opportunity for us to collaborate on that because we are perfectly willing to go through with the foreclosure, but we need to know that we have the support to do so and that we have the right kinds of properties that will be the biggest benefit to the bureaus and to the community when they're actually foreclosed.
And also, like to mention that I appreciate the fact that you said this council is behind the effort, because if you don't have the council behind the effort, you have been here before.
It
You
should
know,
not
we
put
don't
you
go
or the
anywhere.
auditor in that position. That should be something we take on collectively.
Uh-huh.
I want to get you two to wrap up and thank you, because we want
Absolutely.
to bring the next panel up and then
Yeah.
have all of you available for discussion.
We
So-
do have to come with some code changes before we can go through with the foreclosure. They are just to bring the city code into alignment with some changes in state law. They have to do with this a definition of the sales price, the number of bids or the type of bids that we can receive, and they direct the treasurer to implement the foreclosure process in compliance with the new sales price.
And you're bringing those ordinance changes forward?
Yeah, we'll do that in the next month or two.
Okay, great.
Taking 3 cases to the committee. They already have the.
Excellent.
So we are moving. It's a matter
Excellent.
of.
Well, great work.
Keep
Thank you.
moving.
Thank you both.
Before you leave, there was a slide you skipped over, so the collections committee is going to meet on April 13th?
Right,
To
next week.
review the 25 properties that are
The
extremely
first
distressed?
3 properties, yeah. It's a
First 4.
very time-consuming process for Marco to put the case files together, so we've got 3 for them to be looking at next week.
Okay. And I guess just, maybe we can ask this in the bigger discussion, is there something to be said, since we're having so much trouble fleshing out owners, to foreclose first and ask questions later? Let them find us?
Finding the owners.
Okay.
He's finding the owners.
Well, we're finding owners, but they're not doing
They're
anything
buying.
until the foreclosure, yeah. So that's what I guess that's what I mean, is foreclose first, let them come up and settle their accounts.
Exactly. Or notice of foreclosure.
We
Yeah.
have a process that we had before. So we have, and that's what we are doing. We are following our process, and sometimes in the course of doing that, they come and pay, but doesn't mean that the problem with the house has been taken care of.
Thanks.
Here to talk about both the foreclosure issue, but also the receivership idea, and that is Zach Klonowski again, Simon Wong from City Attorney's Office, and Diane Lin from Proud Ground. You're going to stay there, Simon, or you can come up here if you want, whichever.
I'm comfortable here.
Okay. He's comfortable in that spot. So we
Can
appreciate.
somebody define receivership?
Yes.
Yes, I will
Okay.
take that on. I'm very glad to see the conversation that we're having, and that receivership has come up as a possible tool that we already have in city code to deal with some of these houses. And the key thing is to address the underlying nuisance that is plaguing these properties. And that's what the receivership tool really does, which is why it's an effective tool, and it's been used in other cities to great effect. So what receivership is the law allows property owners to be sued for code violations and lose their homes if they fail to make repairs. So what it is, it's a legal means to eliminate a public nuisance. For the lawyers among us, it functions similar to injunctive relief in that it provides equitable relief through a court order and appointment of a receiver to abate a property nuisance. It's a very aggressive and effective tool for dealing with absentee property owners who have let a property fall into disrepair. It provides an expedited process for nuisance abatement. Abatement can begin in a matter of months, whereas with foreclosure, we've seen it can take anywhere from 12 to 24 months, and that's a good situation. It can take a decade even, as we've seen through testimony today. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it's proven very effective in other cities, most notably in Baltimore, through their Vacants to Value program. It's a little different than what we have in City Code, but it's very similar and functions in pretty much the same way. And so I have the code language for the receivership program, which is in Title 29 or Chapter 29, and then also a flow chart that will walk us through the receivership process. So, what triggers a receivership, or at least the authority to use a receivership? Under a property code violations that threatens the public's health, safety, or welfare. Examples have been mentioned today: broken windows, trash and debris in the yard, rat infestation, blocked sidewalks, et cetera, et cetera. And if the owner does not act in a timely manner to correct the violation, notice can be sent to parties of the intent to petition the court to appoint a receiver. So the city attorney can petition the court to appoint a receiver. If no interested party has taken any action to foreclose their security interest within 60 days of that notice going out, the BDS director may apply for the appointment of receiver in court. From there, the court can then look at the property and deem whether it's a good candidate for receivership, which I don't think any of these properties a judge will take a second look at. They're obvious candidates. And then select a receiver. And if you look at the flow chart, it's laid out very plainly that there are 4 different options for selecting a receiver. It can be the Housing Authority of Portland, Home Forward, a city bureau, an urban renewal agency, or a private not-for-profit corporation, the primary purpose of which is the improvement of housing conditions within the city. So once a receiver is appointed, within 30 days of appointment by the court, the receivers will submit to the BDS director a written plan for abatement. So their plan for dealing with the underlying nuisance that is plaguing that property and makes it a good candidate for the receivership program. Then the court approves that plan, and the receiver then would begin that abatement work and put the house back into a saleable condition. And then if the costs and the obligations incurred due to the abatement have not been paid in a timely fashion, the receiver then can take an action to court to foreclose on that receivership lien. So that's the framework of the program. And what it does is it allows us to get at the underlying property nuisance and not allow the property owner at the last minute to come in and get on a payment plan and come into compliance, yet not address the underlying livability issue that is plaguing the city. And so this tool can work, it can complement our new, hopefully, foray into the foreclosure issue with the auditor's office. And there'll be situations where foreclosure is appropriate, and there'll be situations where receivership's appropriate, and we'll just have to do it on a case-by-case basis.
So we already have this? This is already in code?
It's already in city code, and it's been used in the past.
When?
I think the early 2000s is what I've been told by BDS and by the program. And so what this does is this can force land speculators and others gaming the system by paying down liens and property taxes, but not addressing the underlying nuisance to kind of put up or shut up. Essentially, it will allow the city to fire a property owner who is not being responsible and not taking care of their property and is paying their property taxes to avoid a county foreclosure process, but not addressing the underlying issue and then waiting for land value to go up before they make a sale. And what we've seen, which is really makes us an attractive tool, is that in 75 to 90% of cases, once the city petitions the court to appoint a receiver, at the drop of a hat, that the property owner comes in and will either restore the property and get it into a saleable condition, or will voluntarily sell the property in 75 to 90% of the cases. So even just the threat, and this is in Baltimore, so.
I mean, our real estate market is a little better. Baltimore's not doing
Yeah.
badly these days, but I think real estate in Portland's a little hotter.
Yes, and so I spoke with some of the people that run the program in Baltimore, and they said this is an extremely effective tool. They can't recommend it highly enough. And the good news is it works even better in hot real estate markets, obviously, because there's more of a market. So once the information's out there, people are lining up to buy these problem properties. So that's the basic idea of the receivership program. I have Diane Lynn here from Proud Ground, who I've been talking to about potentially partnering with the city to act as receiver for dealing with these nuisance properties.
Good morning. Am I on? Good morning. Diane Lynn, Executive Director of Proud Ground. Happy to be here today. Really thrilled at the prospect of being able to at least play a role in defining how a receivership could work. It doesn't preclude any other partners from stepping up, but we have a concept that Zach and your team have approached us about, and we've submitted a proposal in rough form that really would suggest that in order to really move this process along, which you've heard today is really the tough part, there's just barrier after barrier, and to get through those barriers, given our past history, my staff has worked with the team here at the city in the past, and because there's one thing after the other that comes up, there's people involved and complex legal and procedural challenges, you have to have a way to really move forward. The dots have to connect. And what we would be proposing is to step in when the city has exhausted its resources and partner with the city to help evaluate homes, see what needs to be done, go out and look at it, kind of play a role in identifying the components of a plan that could be presented to a judge, hypothetically, and that a receivership possibility would follow that. we would really build into the process, again, being able to move forward on these. The neighbors you've heard from today, the neighbors we know about, and my years at the Office of Neighborhood Associations completely remember how devastating this can be, and time is of the essence when people are living next to these properties. So we would suggest that the city really consider a way to get an outside partner to assist the city when it's time to apply the kind of skill set that we used in the neighborhood stabilization program, the NSP program, where there were tax foreclosed properties. The federal government came in, gave us some resources to purchase those properties, renovate them all the way back up to standards, and then sell them on the market. And this program actually provides the tools to kind of make everyone whole in that process. So it gives us kind of all the components we need, as long as we're committing to, again, connecting all those dots and moving forward on the process so we can expedite for the sake of the neighborhood and the neighbors. Happy to answer any questions.
Let me just turn to Simon first, and that is, Simon, if we make the ordinance changes that Sarah described before, and given the authority that we have now for receivership, are there any other legal impediments to us starting this machinery and moving forward?
No. There are no code changes that are necessary to the receivership. All the tools are in place, legally speaking. And with respect to city code for foreclosures, state law allows foreclosure to proceed either under municipal code or under state law for a lien foreclosure. So that's already something that's available to us. But I certainly understand how city code should match up with the state code to get basically modern and to be streamlined.
So if I'm hearing your answer correct, not being a lawyer, we can start doing receivership on these 25 or so properties tomorrow?
Well, let's just be clear. That we could start the process. And as you heard earlier, sometimes the threat of foreclosure and/or receivership can actually result in the improvement of a property sooner than later, which is actually a better outcome as many times as possible, right?
I'd be happy for Diane's organization to end up renovating some of these houses, but I would also be happy to, like we did in an earlier chapter of this kind of issue, work you out of a job, because having these property owners fix it up first. So there's a little echo here for the two of us, because when I first took office as a city commissioner, there were 2,000 vacant and abandoned houses in North and Northeast Portland, just in North and Northeast Portland. We relied very heavily on nonprofit community development corporations, whether it was Host or Reach or others, to work their way through that inventory in a much different real estate market. So I think, among the options here, who could be the receiver? Home Forward, maybe. Housing Bureau, probably not, because they've got other things to focus on. PDC, no thank you. I've got other things. I think we've all got other things we want them to focus on. Using a nonprofit or a set of nonprofits to be the receiver, to me, is the best of those four options. It's not like the public agencies couldn't do it, but they're focused on other missions, and they're not as nimble at the granular level of this house or that block as the CDCs or nonprofits are.
And you would envision doing some kind of a request for proposals to offer, see who's interested.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Ground's interested. Maybe there's some others that are interested. Again, some of our nonprofits are focused on much bigger projects now. Reach. I was on the Reach board. Reach used to do little projects. Now they do big projects. They do great big projects. I don't know if they would be interested, but some of the nonprofits would, and some of them probably wouldn't.
And two things to note. One, the main obstacle to instituting this program would be identifying a receiver, because you can't go to the court and ask to appoint a receiver if you don't have one already identified. The second would be this is a legal tool, and so we need to look at what the city attorney's office would need to just get this program up and running, because there is quite a bit of legal work involved.
Have we asked Home Forward about their interests?
I've reached out to a number of organizations. I reached out to Home Forward. I can't remember off the top of my head what their response was, but I can get you that information.
And is at the other end, after we fix them up, or the nonprofit has fixed them up, is there a way to keep it in affordable housing and not just sell it to the highest bidder, which is going to be some developer, which might even knock it down again?
We discussed this, Commissioner as you can imagine, our greatest hope would be that some of these houses could in fact end up in an affordability portfolio of some kind. It may not be permanent, it may not be, the lowest end of the MFI spectrum. We have to be very careful that once the houses are sold at auction, which is the process you have to go through, that's done fairly and is orchestrated with all fairness, no deference to any entity. At the same time, we work with all those agencies across the state, at the city, and would want to suss out any possibility that the home actually could be in a place where additional subsidy or support could bring the house into an affordability status. And again, in the RFP process, that could be part of what we want to keep our eye on. We want to keep our eye on that prize. We just can't buy it ourselves in auction as receiver. We can't. That's one thing we can't do. But we'd like to. That would be an ultimate goal, if possible.
That's what we might have to devote some of our resources.
Yeah, I figured you would have thought of that.
Yeah, of
With
course.
the county property tax, if they default there, then doesn't government get the first option to buy county properties?
Yes, if a house is 6 years in default in terms of its Multnomah County property taxes, then Multnomah County can foreclose on the house and take possession of the house.
So have we talked to them about how urgent they could do that?
We have been talking. I understand that the mayor's team has been talking to Multnomah County with respect to how they do their foreclosures, but it's a entirely different process since it involves property taxes and it's very narrow for that purpose. It's a little bit apples and oranges with respect to how the city would conduct, say, any foreclosure under city programs versus what the county does.
I don't understand all the legal wrinkles to this, but I think it would take a change to state law to be able to have a program similar to what the county does.
No, I wasn't suggesting. I was just what an additional level could be if we can encourage them to foreclose on some of these, then we do get to have first bite at the apple, because we've done that in parks where there's been vacant lots. We've gotten to the first right of refusal and have been able to buy some properties in natural areas, for example.
And that's a great point, but with the property tax foreclosure, it takes a 6-year period of being delinquent before I believe they're allowed to foreclose.
Well, Sally, the one next to Sally, has been not doing so well for 6 years.
Yeah, except some of these owners are, again, sophisticated enough to know which bills to pay
Yeah.
to stay just one step short of trouble. And so it would be nice. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, I hear you, Commissioner, and I think one thing I want to note is, I think I'm translating this correctly from what I'm hearing from both of my colleagues. I believe there's a strong interest not only in moving forward, but in making sure that to the extent possible, the houses that come out the other end of this pipeline are made available for affordable home ownership. Now, that might require other program connections and other resources, but we have some dedicated towards affordable home ownership, at least in some parts of the city, and we could have more under our state of emergency efforts or in our next budget. So I'm very interested in connecting those dots. Again, as a former board member of a nonprofit that worked itself out of a job, Host, bought distressed properties, fixed them up, sold them to people in North and Northeast Portland with a desire of keeping people in the neighborhoods in better housing. It largely worked. In fact, it did work. It worked so well that they worked themselves out of a job because there aren't enough vacant and abandoned houses in North and Northeast to keep Host going anymore, so they folded. Great. But it might take other resources partnered up with this in order to get to that outcome, since we can't have a discretionary sale at the end of the receiver project. So other questions or points on this front with this team, or for any of our presenters who've walked us through all this today, from either of you?
Well, I certainly appreciate having this work session. It's definitely opened my eyes to the frustrations that many people in the city feel about living next to these properties, and frustrations with the processes involved because we are dealing with property rights. But I'm all for figuring out a way to make things happen quicker. And even if there's some legal risk, I think it's worth it to take the risk in order to clean up these properties and get them into constructive home ownership and affordable.
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank everybody who's been here today and all of you who are working on this. This is one of the most hopeful things going on right now in city government, because this is a big, ugly, complex problem that involves multiple bureaus and tests the question of whether we can act like one organization or whether we're a whole bunch of silos that don't talk to each other. I think what we're hearing from the folks that we've heard from today is a spirit of cooperation and of empathy that's really important. I think we all see these houses and listen to these stories, and I think we reach the same word, which is this is unacceptable. No one should have to live next to a house like this anywhere, especially in a city with a great real estate market, lots of people looking for housing, and plenty of folks that are unhoused that need a place to live. So I think all of us reach that conclusion, and what I'm hearing from the folks that Chad and Zach have brought together is that there's a real interest in making this work. So, Auditor, thank you for you and your staff and the great work you're doing now, and for the commitment to make this work. And again, there's some political cover that, I'm going to be blunt about this, we as a city council need to say to our staff, it is okay to take the political and legal risk of foreclosing on trashed out houses that are empty of legal owners, maybe occupied occasionally by squatters. It is okay to take the legal risk to foreclose or send into receivership those distressed properties. That is in the public interest. And we, as we take action on the ordinance that you're going to bring forward and on the foreclosure ordinances that you bring to us, again, I don't think that's a big political risk, but let's be clear, we're the ones that take that risk. I think it's a risk very much worth taking. We will save a fortune in police costs, in BDS costs, and, to use the old MasterCard phrase, the impact on neighbors is going to be priceless. I mean, you've never counted the cost of what this has meant to you financially, but what it has meant to you psychically as a mom and as a neighbor having to live next to this. Frankly, I can't imagine how bad it's been for you. So thank you for being patient, still smiling when you come here, instead of spitting nails at us for being such a slow bureaucracy in responding to this crisis. But I think we can respond a lot better, and this is a really hopeful piece of work. Oh, right, the registry program. Sorry, we left Chad out on the registry program. So come talk about that, please. Thank you both.
That's okay. So just wanted to provide a little bit of, yes, yeah. I'll be real brief. Just wanted to provide a little bit more context, historical context. As we go down our list of recommendations for you, one thing that happened back in 2012 was council visited the idea of a vacant registry program. And this was a proposal put forward. It involved the Bureau of Development Services, Bureau of Technology Services, and the Revenue Bureau. And the idea, put simply, is to really get upstream with identifying these houses as they come into our radar early on, and so that they have to be registered in a place. And so it's a consolidated list that we're all looking at. And there are some smaller municipalities that have had great success with this. I know Hillsboro, Oregon has tried this. It may or may not be the perfect fit for Portland. We have Title 29 here working for us, so that might be a reason why we don't necessarily need to explore the option of a vacant registry program, but I want to put that out there on the table as something to possibly reconsider that might complement our new work, because back in 2012 we also didn't have this nuanced of a conversation and put forth a multi-pronged approach with existing tools. And then lastly, wanted to also reemphasize our relationship with the banks. And as I go down our list of final recommendations, one of them is better collaboration internally. So Zach and I worked with our partners who have presented here today to have a meeting with a number of bank representatives a few months ago. And the meeting was very, very interesting because we got to have this kind of conversation. And one of our goals was to, show them a list of 25 vacant distressed properties that Mitch McKee and his team had brought together, but then also put the question to the banks of who is attached to any of these houses. The bad news was that none of the banks that were in the room that day actually were attached to those particular houses. The good news is that we were able to figure out some other banks that weren't invited that day who were, in fact, attached to those houses. And so one thing that I would like to emphasize is just the city's collaboration with the banks And as we think about our first recommendation, which is better collaboration, perhaps designating an internal vacant distressed property unit or a vacant distressed property committee that would probably be comprised of the people that you heard from today or from their respective offices, who are all involved on this first and foremost. And so they understand this complex policy issue. They understand the different kinds of approaches that the city is taking and can focus on this particular issue. But then also that team can be charged with maintaining something of a relationship with our external holders, such as the banks, for ongoing meetings, because that partnership is important as well. I put down the public. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Actually, I didn't print it off, so I will send it. I will send it to your offices. I apologize. Yeah. Okay. So I'll make sure that that you each get one of those. The public list idea is something that we came across down in Oakland, California, where neighbors really they were experiencing a very bad vacant distressed property problem down there. Most of them probably didn't understand the ins and outs like we've talked about today. They were just really angry, much like and quite emotional, as you can imagine from hearing testimony from Sally earlier about living next to these homes. And so what they did is they ended up really going public with the banks. And that kind of public pressure on the banks proved to be very effective in terms of raising awareness to them. And so in our research on the banks, just in terms of identifying this problem and understanding this problem, being proactive on this problem, we still think that it's not really on their radar as something that they fully understand, which is all the more reason why it's so important at the local level that we take the initiative here in Portland by having all of our offices work internally and create that system of communication and collaboration to push the needle on this. And so I put public list as one possible tool that could be used. We could post it on somewhere on our city's website that shows our ongoing top list of 25 houses and with pictures and the attached bank, just to make sure that it's noticed publicly. On the second one, of course, just I want to recap our recommendations. So very quickly, better collaboration. 2 is our foreclosure program. So you heard from Sarah Landis in the auditor's office. Perhaps it's the most surefire way and efficient way of addressing these homes at the local level. You heard from Zach on the receivership model, and we want to make sure that that happens, the two happening congruently. The vacant registry program is another idea, along with the list, the public list, and just having all of those working together, because this problem you heard is from the testimony, it's been here. It's still here. It's likely going to be here unless we keep collaborating and keep working actively to do something about it. And so I would recommend those.
Well, thank you. Well, yeah, let's get that out to the council. My intention would be to move forward with both the foreclosure effort that's now underway and the receivership model. The list idea, interesting. We can talk about that some more. Whether publicly disclosing who we're targeting is appropriate or not. I'm less persuaded by that, frankly. I don't know how you guys feel about that, but what matters
Seems
most
like it might be advertising, hey, this place is vacant.
Yeah,
Move
I'm
on
not
in.
sure if that's all that helpful, but if we're actually moving forward on receivership and foreclosure on the houses themselves, to me, that's the most critical piece.
I'd like to add another suggestion. Every 5 years, we do a request for proposals for banks that do all our check writing and processing. Why don't we have a criteria that says you cannot have any properties on our extremely distressed property list if you want to qualify to be, our lending financial services bank.
Wonderful connection. Yeah, that's great. Great. Anything else?
I think there might be some purpose in not listing the specific properties, but listing the banks with the number of properties that we've got on our list.
Okay, all right. I like that idea. Great. Well, again, thank you, colleagues. This has been a good discussion, and as you can tell, a lot of work by not just the 2 people in my office, but all the other folks that we've heard from today has gone into this effort. I really appreciate it. And our long-suffering police officers who've had to be in the squirrel cage on this issue, we hope that help is on the way. Thank you all very much.